One cold Friday night, I found myself alone at home. My parents had left town on business, and the house's quiet was oddly unnerving. I could feel the stillness in every corner, like a presence lurking just out of sight. Thankfully, I had plans with my friend to break the silence. Tonight, we were heading to the cinema to watch The Watcher, a brand new horror movie that had been getting great reviews. It was supposed to be one of the year's scariest movies, and I thought it'd be fun to catch it, especially since my friend and I were horror movie fanatics. As I waited for my friend to pick me up, I paced around, checking every window and locking every door. I don't usually get creeped out alone, but something about tonight's empty house put me on edge. Finally, my friend pulled up outside, honking to signal me. I quickly double-checked the locks, grabbed my jacket, and ran out. The theater was packed, filled with people excited to experience the terror of The Watcher. We grabbed popcorn and made our way to our seats, already feeling the thrill of the night ahead. The lights dimmed and the previews started. Soon enough, the feature presentation began. The movie was more terrifying than I'd imagined. The plot centered around a sinister figure who appeared to be following the protagonist wherever they went, always just a few steps behind. The creepy part was that no one else could see him. It was as if he was part of the shadows, always lurking in the background. His eyes were hollow, dark, and relentless, locked onto his target with an intensity that made everyone in the theater uneasy. Each time he appeared on screen, it felt like he was watching us too. I felt my spine tingle as I glanced around, just to reassure myself we were alone in our seats. The movie ended, and the audience was left in silence, too shocked to speak. My friend and I exchanged glances, both of us a bit shaken. We laughed it off, pretending not to be as scared as we were. But deep down, that feeling of being watched still clung to me, making me feel uneasy as we exited the theater. When we got to the parking lot, my friend tried starting his car, but nothing happened. He turned the key again, but the engine just made a weak, sputtering noise and fell silent. "Great timing, right?" he muttered, trying once more. But it was clear the car wasn't going anywhere. "Well," I said, "guess we're walking." We both forced a laugh, but the fear from the movie still lingered in the back of our minds. The streets were empty, and the night felt heavier somehow, like a thick fog pressing down on us as we started walking. Halfway down a narrow, empty street, I thought I heard footsteps behind us. I turned to look, but no one was there. Just shadows stretching across the pavement under the dim streetlights. My friend shrugged it off, saying it was probably our nerves playing tricks on us after the movie. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We walked a few more blocks, and that's when I saw him, a dark figure standing at the end of the street, motionless, his face hidden in shadow. I squinted, thinking it might just be a trick of the light, but my friend saw him too. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My friend nodded, his face pale. We exchanged a worried glance and quickened our pace, our footsteps echoing in the silent night. We turned the corner onto another street, hoping to lose him. But there he was again, already ahead of us, standing perfectly still with those hollow, dark eyes fixed on us. My heart pounded in my chest as fear took hold. It was like something out of the movie, except this time there was no screen separating us from the figure. He was real, and he was watching us. My friend's voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe we should split up. If he's following both of us, we might confuse him if we go separate ways." I hesitated, the thought of walking alone even more terrifying than staying together. But he was right. We nodded at each other, and with a forced smile, he wished me luck. We parted ways, each turning down different streets. As I walked alone, the silence grew heavier, broken only by the sound of my footsteps. Every few moments, I glanced over my shoulder, my heart hammering with each step. That feeling of being watched grew stronger until it was almost unbearable. I quickened my pace, nearly jogging, desperate to get home and lock myself away from whatever was following me. But as I turned onto the last street before my house, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the street, was the man. He stood under the flickering streetlight, his face still obscured, but his dark eyes glowed faintly in the shadows. He was waiting for me, I felt paralyzed, unable to move or look away. His eyes seemed to bore into me as if he could see into my very soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. With every ounce of strength, I forced myself to move, slowly and cautiously, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. As I drew closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold: his face. It was hollow and blank, like a mask with empty, dark holes for eyes. The same hollow face I'd seen in the movie, except this wasn't on a screen. This was real, and he was right in front of me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, sprinting down the street, barely able to breathe. My house was just a few blocks away. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence behind me, those unblinking eyes watching my every move. Finally, I reached my house, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I managed to unlock the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking every bolt and chain. My heart raced as I ran to my room and peeked out the window, hoping he was gone. But there, under the streetlight outside my house, he stood, staring up at my window with those same hollow eyes. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, watching. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was this some cruel prank? Or had the watcher somehow come to life, stepping out of the screen and into my world? I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house jolted me awake, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows seemed to stretch and move, each one holding the outline of that terrible figure, those dark eyes. I could feel him, even when I couldn't see him, waiting outside my window, watching. When the morning finally came, I cautiously peeked outside, half expecting to see him still standing there. But the street was empty, just as it had been before. For the first time in hours, I breathed a sigh of relief, but I knew I'd never forget those eyes, always there, always watching. After months of relentless work, my friend Mark and I finally decided to take a much-needed break. We'd planned a road trip, just the two of us and the open road for a whole week. We each took some vacation days and decided to explore the rugged, isolated areas we'd only ever read about. The goal was to escape everything, our offices, our schedules, our daily routines, and just immerse ourselves in nature. The first few days of our trip went smoothly. We stuck mostly to highways and checked into small motels each night. We were enjoying every bit of it, the breathtaking views, the thrill of adventure, and the pure freedom that came with it. But as the days wore on, we grew bolder, venturing deeper into the wilderness, far away from towns and well-lit roads. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, we found ourselves miles away from any civilization. We hadn't seen another car for hours, and our GPS had long since lost signal. The landscape around us was dense with trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. We realized we'd missed a turn somewhere, and the next motel was at least 200 miles away. It was getting darker, and both of us were exhausted from the long drive. "Guess we're camping tonight," Mark said with a shrug. "It's either that or driving through the night, and I don't think either of us can keep our eyes open much longer." I nodded in agreement. We parked the car off the side of the narrow road and began setting up our tent in a small clearing. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. As darkness settled around us, the silence grew heavier, almost oppressive, but we were too tired to pay much attention. After a quick meal, we climbed into the tent, zipped it up, and settled in for the night. I drifted off quickly, lulled by the stillness of the forest. But sometime around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. A faint crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. At first I thought I'd imagined it, but then I heard it again. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, drawing closer to our tent before stopping suddenly. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath and straining to listen. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, and just as I started to convince myself that it was an animal or just my imagination, the footsteps started again, circling our campsite in an uneven rhythm. I reached over and nudged Mark, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He groggily opened his eyes and listened. The footsteps had stopped again, and we were left in complete silence. Mark shook his head, probably thinking I was just paranoid. But just as he was about to close his eyes, the footsteps returned, this time sounding even closer. We sat up, exchanging a tense look. "Probably just a deer," Mark whispered, though his voice held a hint of uncertainty. He reached for the flashlight, and we listened intently, waiting for the footsteps to start again. Minutes passed in silence. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, each beat seeming to echo in the stillness. Then, just when we thought it was over, the footsteps resumed, louder and more insistent, like someone was purposefully moving through the underbrush. Mark clicked on the flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly. We peeked outside, shining the light in a wide arc around our campsite, but there was nothing there, just the thick trees and the blanket of darkness beyond. "Maybe it's the wind," Mark murmured, though he didn't sound convinced. We both lay back down, but sleep was now out of the question. The footsteps had stopped, but an overwhelming feeling of unease had settled over us. Hours passed, and we remained on edge, listening to every small sound in the night. Just as I was beginning to doze off again, I heard the footsteps once more. This time they were different, faster, almost frantic, as if someone was running just beyond our campsite. The sound moved from one side of the tent to the other, fading in and out, as though whoever or whatever was out there was circling us. Mark and I looked at each other, our faces pale in the dim light of the tent. "I think we should check outside," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I hesitated but nodded, feeling my heart pounding even harder. We unzipped the tent once again and stepped outside, armed with a flashlight and a pocket knife. The night was pitch black, and our flashlight barely pierced the dense darkness. But as we swept the light across the trees, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond the edge of our campsite, there was a faint line scratched into the dirt, winding its way through the trees and disappearing into the darkness. It looked as if someone, or something, had drawn it there intentionally. My heart dropped as I realized it wasn't a natural formation. The line was perfectly straight, stretching along the forest floor like a boundary. Mark's face went pale as he saw it too. We both stared at it in stunned silence, trying to process what we were seeing. The line seemed to lead deeper into the forest, its purpose and origin a complete mystery. We followed it with our eyes, tracing its path as far as the flashlight's beam would allow, but it just kept going, winding its way through the trees like a sinister trail. A sudden rustling sound broke the silence, and we spun around, shining the light into the darkness. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow moving among the trees, a tall, dark figure just beyond the reach of our light. But as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the night. We stood there, frozen, listening to the silence that had returned. My heart was racing, and I could feel Mark's tension beside me. Neither of us spoke. We were too afraid to make a sound, as if the very act of speaking might summon whatever was lurking in the darkness. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "Let's pack up and get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. We hurriedly gathered our things, barely able to see in the dim light of the flashlight, and stuffed everything back into the car as quickly as we could. As we drove away, I glanced back at the campsite, half expecting to see that shadowy figure watching us from the trees. But there was nothing, just the line, stretching into the darkness, leading deeper into the forest, to who knows where. The rest of the night was a blur. We drove in silence, our eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting something to appear behind us. Even when we reached the nearest town and checked into a motel, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, as if something had followed us from the woods. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that line stretching through the trees and that shadow lurking just beyond the light. I knew it was probably nothing, just a trick of the darkness, our minds playing games in the eerie stillness of the forest. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed some kind of boundary that night, stumbled into something we weren't meant to see. And sometimes in the quiet moments just before sleep, I could still hear those footsteps echoing in my mind, circling, waiting, like a dark reminder of what lay hidden in the forest beyond. We had finally found our dream home. After months of searching, we bought a beautiful, spacious house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood was peaceful, the air was fresh, and the house was everything we'd hoped for. My wife and I were thrilled to start this new chapter, and as we settled in, our excitement only grew. The house was older, but it had character. Large rooms, a charming kitchen, and a cozy living room with a fireplace. Our first few days in the house went by in a whirlwind of unpacking and decorating. At night, we were so exhausted that we barely had the energy to do anything but crawl into bed and fall asleep. But despite the exhaustion, my wife, Lily, seemed a bit on edge. She said it was just the stress of moving, and I chalked it up to adjusting to a new place. The house was old, after all, and it had its quirks, the occasional creak in the floorboards, the way the wind seemed to make the walls groan. Nothing out of the ordinary, I told myself. Then, one night after dinner, Lily cleaned up in the kitchen while I finished unpacking in the living room. Suddenly, I heard her call my name, her voice tense. I hurried to the kitchen and found her standing there, her face pale and eyes wide. "What's wrong?" I asked, concerned. I saw someone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Right outside the kitchen window. It was just for a second, but there was a shadow standing there." I looked out the window, but all I could see was the darkness of our backyard. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was probably just her imagination. "You're tired," I said gently. "We both are. The mind can play tricks on you when you're stressed." She didn't argue, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. That night, as we lay in bed, I could feel her tossing and turning beside me. I stayed awake, listening for any strange sounds, half expecting to see a shadow myself. But the house was silent, and eventually we both drifted off to sleep. Over the next few days, the unsettling incidents continued. It wasn't every night, but now and then, Lily would see a fleeting figure in the corner of her eye or hear footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. At first, I dismissed it as nerves. We were adjusting to a new place, after all, and it was only natural to feel a little out of sorts. But then I started noticing things myself. One evening, while working in my home office, I heard faint footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was Lily, but when I called out to her, there was no response. I stepped into the hallway, expecting to find her, but it was empty. My heart began to race, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder as I returned to my desk. The sightings became more frequent after that. Shadows would dart across the walls, and footsteps echoed down the hallway at odd hours. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, as if we were not alone, as if we were being watched. Lily and I were both growing uneasy, though neither of us wanted to admit it. One night we were jolted awake by a loud noise downstairs. It sounded like something had fallen in the kitchen. I grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed down, my heart pounding. I found a stack of plates scattered on the floor, but nothing else seemed out of place. There was no sign of an intruder, no open windows or broken locks. It was as if someone or something had been in the kitchen, just out of sight. After that incident, Lily refused to be alone in the house. She insisted on staying close to me, and every time I left the room, she would call out to check where I was. I couldn't blame her. I was feeling the same fear. The house, once our dream home, was becoming a place of dread. One evening, we were sitting in the living room, talking in hushed tones about what we'd been experiencing. "What if it's haunted?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I could tell she was only half joking. I wanted to dismiss the idea, but deep down I was beginning to wonder myself. Then a shadow moved across the hallway. We both froze, staring, and there it was again, a figure barely visible, but there, lurking just out of reach. It seemed to watch us for a moment before disappearing down the hall. I'd had enough. I wasn't going to let some shadow terrorize us in our own home. I decided to call the police. I told them we'd been seeing a figure in the house and suspected someone was sneaking in. The officers took our report seriously and sent a few officers over to investigate. They searched the house, room by room, but found nothing unusual. I could tell they thought we were just jumpy new homeowners. But then, one of the officers noticed something strange, a loose window latch in the basement. It was barely open, just enough for someone to slip through if they tried hard enough. The officer examined it closely, then glanced at us with a serious expression. "We'll keep an eye on things, but it looks like someone might have been coming in and out through this window," he said. "Do you have any neighbors with kids? Teenagers, maybe?" Lily and I exchanged a glance. There was only one family nearby with children, a quiet couple who lived next door. They had a son, but we'd only seen him a few times, and he always seemed to be by himself, wandering the yard or sitting by the window, staring off into the distance. We didn't know much about him, but we'd heard rumors that he was different. The police took down the information and promised to look into it. A few days later, we received a call. They'd identified the intruder. It was, as we'd suspected, our neighbor's son. He'd been sneaking into our house at night, slipping through the basement window and moving quietly through the rooms. He had some mental health issues and had developed an obsession with our house, fixating on it as some sort of refuge. The police assured us that he would be receiving the help he needed and that his family had promised to keep a closer watch on him. They installed a lock on the basement window to prevent him from coming back. As disturbing as it was to know that someone had been in our house, it was also a relief to finally understand what had been happening. The figure Lily had seen, the shadow in the hallway, the footsteps in the night, it was all him, the boy from next door, moving quietly through our home while we slept. In the days that followed, things began to return to normal. The eerie feeling in the house faded, and Lily and I found ourselves relaxing again. We took measures to secure the house, added a few extra locks, and finally felt at ease. Still, sometimes, late at night, I would catch myself listening to those familiar footsteps, waiting for the shadow to pass by. It was hard to shake the memory of those tense nights of feeling watched, haunted. But each time I reminded myself that we were safe now, that the boy was getting help, and that our home was truly ours again. It was a typically quiet night in my beat, a suburban stretch bordered by dense woods and empty roads. As an officer, my duties mostly involved routine patrols, responding to noise complaints, and occasionally dealing with minor incidents. The residents of the area trusted me to keep their peace intact, and I took pride in their trust. That night, I had just finished my rounds in the small commercial district and was heading back to the station to wrap up paperwork when the station phone rang. It wasn't unusual to get late-night calls, but this one would be different. "Officer Blake," I answered, leaning back in my chair. A man's voice, trembling and filled with fear, came through the line. "Officer, please help me," he said. "There's a man in my house." The urgency in his tone jolted me into focus. "Sir, are you in immediate danger? Are you safe right now?" "I'm hiding," he whispered. "He's in the living room. I don't know how he got in. Please come quickly. The address is 23 Maple Grove." Maple Grove was close, just a few minutes away. "Stay hidden and don't make a sound," I instructed him. "Help is on the way." Before I could ask any more questions, the call dropped. I frowned, trying to call him back, but the line wouldn't reconnect. Grabbing my gear, I left the station, notifying dispatch of the situation. Oddly, there was no acknowledgement from dispatch, but I chalked it up to another technical glitch. The streets were eerily silent as I drove toward Maple Grove. The suburban street was lined with modest homes, their windows dark and their porches bathed in faint yellow light. When I reached the address, I parked my cruiser across the street, turned off the engine, and scanned the house. The single-story home was nondescript, with a flickering porch light that cast unsettling shadows across the yard. Nothing seemed amiss, no open windows, no signs of a break-in. Still, the man's voice haunted me, and I approached cautiously. Before I could open my car door, an icy chill crawled up my spine. I froze, suddenly overcome by the sensation of being watched. My hand instinctively moved to my sidearm as I glanced at my rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. A figure sat in the back seat of my patrol car. The dim light from the dashboard barely illuminated him, but his presence was undeniable. Dressed entirely in black, his face was hidden in shadow, and he sat completely still, as if waiting for me to notice him. My blood turned cold, and I couldn't move for a moment. Then slowly, the figure leaned forward. The light caught his face, or what should have been his face. Instead, there were dark, empty voids where his eyes should have been, staring directly into mine. A deep, primal fear gripped me, and I fumbled for my weapon. But before I could draw it, the world around me went black. When I woke, harsh fluorescent lights above me stung my eyes. I groaned, my head pounding as I tried to sit up. A firm hand gently pressed against my shoulder, keeping me down. "Take it easy," a nurse said. "You're in the hospital." What happened?" I managed to croak. My throat felt dry, my voice weak. "You were found unconscious in your patrol car," she explained. "A resident reported your vehicle parked on the street, and when officers arrived, they found you unresponsive." Memories of the night rushed back. The call, the house, the figure in my car. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog. "The house," I said urgently. "The man who called for help. Did you find him?" The nurse hesitated, a shadow crossing her face. "You'll have to speak with your captain," she said quietly. "He's on his way." Captain Harris arrived a short while later, his face grim. "Blake," he said, pulling a chair beside my bed. "What the hell happened out there?" I told him everything. The desperate call, the address, the figure in my back seat. As I spoke, his expression darkened, and I could tell he was struggling to process what I was saying. "We checked the address," he said finally. 23 Maple Grove has been abandoned for over a decade. No one's lived there since the owner passed away. There was no sign of any disturbance and no record of an emergency call from that location. "What about the man I saw in my car?" I asked, my voice rising. "He was there. I saw him." Harris shook his head. "There was no one in your car when we found you." He hesitated, handing me a folder. "We did find this." Inside were photos of my patrol car's interior. Deep, jagged scratches marred the backs of the front seats as if something, or someone, had clawed at the leather. The sight sent a chill through me. "You've always been a good officer," Harris said. "But whatever happened out there, it wasn't normal." I was cleared to return to duty after a few days, but things were never the same. The streets I had once patrolled with ease now felt unfamiliar and foreboding. Every time I passed Maple Grove, a cold sweat would break out across my skin, and the memory of that shadowed figure would creep into my mind. Worse yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, as I sat in my cruiser, I would glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those hollow, dark eyes staring back at me. And every time I woke in the middle of the night, always at exactly 3:17 a.m., my heart would race and I would feel that same suffocating dread I'd felt in the car. I don't know who or what called me that night. Maybe I never will. But deep down, I know this isn't over. Whatever it was, it found me once, and I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting to find me again. The night was tranquil as I drove along a long stretch of highway, the road ahead illuminated only by the weak glow of my car's headlights. The emptiness of the road was unsettling, with no cars in sight for miles. It was the kind of stillness that made you hyper-aware of every sound, the engine's hum, the steering wheel's creak, and the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long day of errands, when I noticed something unusual in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another late-night traveler. But as the car got closer, a strange unease settled over me. The vehicle behind me was an older sedan, its windows tinted so dark that I couldn't see inside. Something about it felt off, the way it slowed as it neared my car, almost as if its driver was observing me. I glanced back several times, trying to shake the strange feeling, but each glance made me more uncomfortable. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was being watched. Suddenly, the car swerved into the opposite lane and sped past me. For a moment, I could see the back of the car, its taillights glowing like ominous red eyes. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the car vanished into the distance, swallowed by the darkness of the road ahead. I shook my head, laughing nervously at myself. "You're just tired," I muttered, trying to push the incident out of my mind. I turned my focus back to the road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. But the uneasy feeling lingered, and I decided it would be a good idea to stop at the next gas station to refuel and collect myself. After driving for another 15 minutes, I spotted a gas station up ahead, a lonely structure on the edge of the forest, its neon sign flickering weakly. My car's fuel gauge was dipping lower than I liked, so I pulled in, relieved to see the station wasn't completely deserted. A single car was parked at one of the pumps. As I parked next to the other car, a strange odor hit me. A pungent, metallic smell that made my stomach turn. I glanced at the car beside me, noticing the windows were pitch black, even darker than the ones on the vehicle that had passed me earlier. The engine was off, but no one was inside. Something about the car felt eerily familiar, but I couldn't place it. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I stepped out of my car and grabbed the pump to refuel. As I did, my gaze kept drifting back to the mysterious vehicle. The faint moonlight reflecting off its windows made it look even more sinister. I felt a growing urge to look inside to see who or what was there. Unable to resist, I approached the car cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I peered into the driver's side window, the black tint made it impossible to see anything. I moved to the passenger side window and cupped my hands against the glass, trying to block out the glare from the station lights. That's when I saw him. In the back seat of the car sat a man, his face pale and contorted with fear. His mouth was gagged with a black cloth, and his hands were tied tightly with rope. His eyes locked onto mine, wide with desperation. He shook his head frantically as if trying to warn me. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I quickly stepped back, my mind racing. My weapon was in my car, and I needed to act fast. I sprinted back to my vehicle, grabbed my handgun, and turned back toward the mysterious car. As if sensing my movements, the driver of the car suddenly emerged. A man wearing a hood, his face obscured by shadows. He froze for a moment, staring at me as I pointed my weapon at him. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted toward the forest. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to chase him or check on the victim. Deciding the man in the car needed help immediately, I ran back to the vehicle and opened the back door. The captive man, still gagged and bound, looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. I quickly untied the ropes and removed the gag. "Thank you," he gasped, his voice shaky and hoarse. "Thank you, you saved my life. Who are you? What happened?" I asked, helping him out of the car. "My name is Harris," he said, his voice trembling. "I was hitchhiking earlier tonight, and that man offered me a ride. But then he tied me up and said he was taking me into the woods. I thought I was gonna die." His words sent chills down my spine. I quickly led him to my car and called the police, explaining the situation as clearly as I could. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene, their flashing lights illuminating the dark forest. They searched the area for the suspect, but he was nowhere to be found. The abandoned car was taken into custody for evidence, and the police began their investigation. As I watched the scene unfold, Harris turned to me, his face etched with gratitude. "You have no idea how close I was to dying tonight," he said. "If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't seen me, I don't even want to think about what could have happened." I nodded, still shaken by the night's events. The memory of the figure in the forest, the desperate look in Harris's eyes, and the eerie feeling that had plagued me all evening would stay with me forever. Even now, whenever I drive past an empty stretch of road at night, I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those haunting headlights trailing behind me once more. I grew up in a quiet, unassuming town with my parents. Life was simple, and our days followed a predictable rhythm. But when I was 17, a rift began to form between me and my parents, mostly because I was obsessed with video games. My PlayStation was my escape, my solace, but it consumed most of my time. My parents weren't happy about it and constantly urged me to focus on my studies or spend more time outdoors. Our arguments became more frequent, and everything came to a boiling point one night. After dinner, my parents sat me down for yet another lecture. My father's tone was firm as he told me the PlayStation would be taken away for good. My mother, though gentler, agreed. I felt betrayed. Angry and frustrated, I stormed out of the room, refusing to even look at them. My room upstairs no longer felt like my space. In my rage, I decided to move all my things to the basement, a decision fueled by teenage stubbornness and a desire to distance myself from my parents. The basement was surprisingly beautiful. We had recently renovated it with new furniture, giving it a modern and cozy feel. A sleek couch sat near the wall, accompanied by a small coffee table and a stylish lamp. The hardwood floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and a new bed with a plush mattress was set up in the corner. Despite being underground, the basement felt warm and inviting, like a perfect retreat from the world upstairs. I thought it was the ideal place to claim as my own, away from my parents' nagging. The first night, I settled in with my bedding and a few personal items. As I lay in bed, I noticed how silent the basement was. The kind of silence that amplifies every creak and rustle. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia and eventually drifted off to sleep. The second night, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps above me. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, moving back and forth across the floor. My first thought was that my parents were awake, but the sound didn't match their usual movements. I lay there frozen, listening as the footsteps grew louder, then softer, until they stopped altogether. When I asked my parents about it the next morning, they insisted they hadn't been awake and told me I was probably imagining things. The next day, things took an even stranger turn. I woke up to find all the drawers in the basement wide open. My clothes and other belongings were scattered across the floor. Confused and slightly unnerved, I assumed my younger sister might have been playing a prank. When I confronted her, she looked genuinely confused and denied ever stepping foot in the basement. My parents brushed off my concerns, saying it was probably me forgetting I had opened them. I knew better, but I didn't push the issue. Over the next few days, the unease in the basement grew. I would hear faint whispers at night, so soft I couldn't make out the words. Shadows would flicker across the walls, even though there was no light source that could explain them. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that my anger toward my parents and my decision to isolate myself had made me paranoid. But one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room felt colder than usual, and the silence was oppressive. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when I turned my head, I saw it clearly. A figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and dark, its outline barely visible against the shadows of the basement. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, watching me. After what felt like hours, I managed to close my eyes, silently praying it would go away. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my heart racing with fear. The next morning, I finally told my father about everything. The footsteps, the whispers, the figure. He didn't take me seriously at first, brushing it off as nightmares or an overactive imagination. But when he came downstairs to check, he found the drawers still open and felt the strange chill that lingered in the air. That night, my father stayed with me in the basement to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. We both settled into our respective beds, but neither of us fell asleep. Around 2 a.m., he shook me awake. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing toward the far wall. I followed his gaze and saw it again, the same dark figure, standing motionless. This time, it felt more menacing, as if it knew we were watching it. My father grabbed my arm, and we bolted upstairs without looking back. The following morning, we packed up the essentials and left the house. My parents didn't want to talk about what happened, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They put the house up for sale within days, pricing it low to get rid of it as quickly as possible. We moved in with my aunt while my parents searched for a new home. To this day, I still don't know what I saw in that beautiful basement. Whether it was a spirit, a shadow of my own emotions, or something else entirely, I'll never forget the oppressive feeling that surrounded me on those final nights. Even now, as an adult, I avoid basements whenever possible, haunted by the memory of the dark figure that drove us from our home. My name is Cale Durnan, and I've been a truck driver for over 15 years. My usual route runs along Highway 79, a lonely stretch of road cutting through vast plains and thick, shadowy forests. Over the years, I've encountered my share of strange sights on the road. Wandering animals, distant flashes of light, and eerie shadows that I always dismissed as tricks of a tired mind. But one night, a chilling event occurred that I've never been able to forget or talk about. Even now, as I write this, I feel the weight of it pressing on me. It was late November, the kind of night where the cold creeps into your bones, no matter how high the truck's heater is cranked. I was hauling construction supplies to a remote town 300 miles away. The road was empty, the sky a blanket of inky black, and the hum of the truck's engine was the only sound breaking the stillness. Highway 79 had a reputation for being isolated, but that night it felt particularly lonely. As I rounded a bend near a dense patch of forest, my headlights illuminated a scene that made my stomach drop. Two cars had collided in the middle of the road, their mangled frames glinting under the pale moonlight. Steam rose from the wreckage, and shards of glass glittered like scattered stars across the asphalt. I slowed the truck and pulled over, heart pounding. The accident looked fresh, too fresh. My instinct to help kicked in, but something about the scene felt off. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. As I approached, the eerie silence of the crash struck me. There were no cries for help, no groans of injured passengers, just the faint hiss of steam and the creak of twisted metal. My pulse quickened, but I pressed on. When I reached the first car, I saw the driver slumped over the wheel, motionless. A chill ran down my spine. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. My flashlight beam moved to the second car, and that's when I saw him. A man standing by the passenger side, his face hidden in shadow. Relief washed over me at first. Someone was alive. "Hey, do you need help?" "I've got a radio in the truck. I can call for assistance," I said, my voice echoing in the stillness. The man turned slowly, and as he stepped into the light, I noticed his cold, piercing eyes. He was holding something, a pistol. Before I could react, he raised it and aimed it directly at my head. "Back to your truck," he growled, his voice low and menacing. I raised my hands, heart hammering. "Take it easy. I don't want any trouble." I backed away slowly, my mind racing. As I turned toward the truck, I noticed movement in the trees lining the road. Shadows flickered between the trunks, and I realized the man wasn't alone. There were more of them, creeping closer. I reached the cab of my truck and climbed in, slamming the door shut. My hands shook as I fumbled to start the engine. The man stood motionless in the road, his pistol still pointed at me. As soon as the truck roared to life, I floored it, swerving around the wreckage and speeding down the highway. My heart didn't stop pounding until the headlights of the wreck disappeared in the rearview mirror. I drove through the night, refusing to stop until I reached the outskirts of the next town. When I finally pulled into a truck stop, my hands were still trembling. I parked and stumbled out, desperate to tell someone what had happened. That's when I saw my friend Garrett, another trucker who often ran the same route. "Cale, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, concern etched on his face. I recounted the incident, sparing no detail. Garrett listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, he leaned in close and said, "That sounds like the Black Forest gang. They've been targeting drivers on this stretch for months. Police have been looking for them, but they always disappear before anyone can catch them." Chills ran down my spine. I asked him what I should do, and he urged me to report it to the authorities immediately. Before I could act, however, Garrett's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and cursed under his breath. "Another trucker's missing," he muttered. "They found his rig abandoned near the forest." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had escaped, but others hadn't been so lucky. I called the police and gave them a detailed report of what I'd seen, including the description of the man with the pistol. They promised to investigate and assured me they'd send officers to patrol the area. But as days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of that night were still following me. Months later, I learned that Garrett's rig had been found abandoned on the same stretch of Highway 79. His fate remains a mystery, but deep down, I know what happened. I can only hope that sharing my story will serve as a warning to others traveling lonely roads. Some places hold secrets best left undiscovered, and some shadows are more than just tricks of the light. It was a crisp Thanksgiving evening, and our family had gathered around the dining table, the warmth of laughter and the scent of roasted turkey filling the house. My father sat at the head of the table, carving the turkey with his usual precision, while my mother bustled about, ensuring everyone had their favorite dishes within reach. My little brother Ethan was excitedly piling mashed potatoes onto his plate, and I was sipping on cider, savoring the cozy atmosphere of the holiday. Just as we were about to dig in, there was a loud knock at the door. The sound startled us. We weren't expecting anyone. My father frowned, setting the carving knife down, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, he saw a man standing on the porch, hunched over as if from exhaustion. "Who could it be?" my mother whispered, her hands wringing nervously. My father opened the door slightly, keeping the chain latch in place. "Can I help you?" he asked. The man's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with desperation. His clothes were tattered, and his voice trembled as he said, "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but I haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm homeless, and I was wondering if you could spare some food." There was a pause as my father considered the situation. Despite his initial hesitation, his compassion won out. He closed the door briefly, unlocked the chain, and opened it fully. "Come in," he said. "You can sit in the living room while I fix you a plate." The man stepped inside, his movements sluggish but his gaze alert, scanning the room. My father led him to the living room and told him to sit on the couch while he returned to the kitchen to prepare some food. The man nodded, murmuring his thanks as he sat down, his eyes darting around as if he were uneasy. We tried to carry on with dinner, but the atmosphere had shifted. My mother glanced nervously toward the living room every few seconds, and Ethan clung to his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. Something about the man's presence didn't feel right, but we couldn't pinpoint why. Minutes later, the sound of a loud, repetitive alarm shattered the uneasy silence. We realized it was the emergency alert system from a police app on my father's phone. He picked it up, his face growing pale as he read the notification. It warned residents about a dangerous man believed to be part of a gang that had been targeting families in nearby neighborhoods. The description of the suspect matched the man sitting in our living room. Before my father could say anything, the man appeared in the doorway between the living room and dining room. His demeanor had changed entirely. He stood taller, his expression no longer one of desperation, but of cold calculation. In his hand was a gun. "Don't move," he said, his voice calm but filled with menace. We froze in place, our breaths caught in our throats. The man gestured for us to remain seated as he slowly walked toward my father. "You're going to do exactly what I say," he continued, his eyes sweeping over all of us. "If you try anything, you'll regret it." Ethan, who had been quietly inching toward the back hallway, was unnoticed by the man. He slipped away, his small figure disappearing into the shadows. My mother's eyes darted toward him, but she quickly looked away, hoping not to draw attention. The man demanded that my father hand over his wallet and any valuables in the house. My father complied, his hands shaking as he handed over his wallet and pointed to a drawer where some cash was kept. The man smirked, pocketing the money. "Smart choice," he said. Meanwhile, Ethan had reached the back room where my father kept an old landline phone. He dialed 911 with trembling fingers, whispering to the operator about the situation. The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way and instructed him to stay hidden. Back in the dining room, the tension was unbearable. The man paced back and forth, the gun never leaving his hand. "You're lucky," he said, his tone almost casual. "Usually we don't leave witnesses, but it's Thanksgiving, so maybe I'll be generous." Before anyone could respond, the distant sound of sirens pierced the night. The man's smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl of frustration. He pointed the gun at my father. "What did you do?" he shouted. My father raised his hands. "We didn't do anything. Please don't hurt us." The man's eyes flickered with panic as the sirens grew louder. He backed away toward the living room, his movements erratic. Just as he reached the front door, there was a loud bang. The door burst open, and several police officers stormed in, weapons drawn. "Drop the gun!" one of them shouted. The man hesitated for a moment before tossing the weapon to the floor. The officers swarmed him, pinning him to the ground and securing him in handcuffs. We sat frozen, the shock of the ordeal washing over us as the officers led the man away. One of the officers stayed behind to take our statements. When we recounted what had happened, his face grew grim. "You're lucky," he said. "This guy is part of a gang we've been tracking for months. They've been breaking into homes and murdering families. If your son hadn't called us when he did..." He let the sentence trail off, but the implication was clear. Ethan emerged from the back room then, his face pale but determined. My mother pulled him into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us," she whispered. The officers collected evidence and left us with words of caution. We spent the rest of the night in a daze, the warmth of Thanksgiving replaced by an unsettling chill. Though we were safe, the shadow of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of how close we had come to tragedy. To this day, we lock our doors the moment the sun sets and never open them for strangers, no matter how desperate they seem.